Last Tuesday, I visited a friend who just finished smart mapping her entire house. She was standing there in the middle of her kitchen and just vibrating with this strange frenetic energy. Her AI assistant was chirping, every 30 seconds. It was notifying her that the humidity in the nursery was 2% off, that the organic kale in the fridge would expire in 4 hours, and that the robot vacuum had run into a, quote, structural anomaly under the sofa. She wasn't working, not in the traditional sense, but she was processing data with the intensity of a high-frequency trader. She called it total domestic optimization. And to her, this digital dashboard was the ultimate proof of her autonomy. But then I looked over at her husband. He was just sitting on the porch, staring at a tree, seemingly oblivious to this. The symphony of alerts coming from inside. And when she snapped at him to validate the algorithmic grocery queue, he didn't even turn around. He just exhaled slowly and said, "The fridge knows what it's doing, Sarah. I'm not joining the committee." And that moment, that sharp, jagged contrast between her hyper-vigilant management and his total, almost cold withdrawal is fascinating. On the surface, it looks like a classic case, right? A stressed wife and a lazy husband. We've all seen that movie before, but as I watched them, I realized we're witnessing something far more radical. We were promised that by 2026, AI would liberate us from the drudgery of the home. Instead, for women, it's weaponized an ancient biological instinct for environmental control. It's turned the domestic sphere into this inescapable digital panopticon. And for men, they've realized that the only way to maintain their sovereignty in this infinite hallway of optimization is a quiet, calculated, and total retreat. It isn't a technological failure, it's a biological collision. Why does automation feel like a new form of enslavement for her? And why is he choosing to become a ghost in his own smart home?
That whole story, it provides the perfect clinical data to really start this deep dive. Our mission today is to analyze the psychological fallout of automation, specifically how this AI-driven domestic management is contributing to a kind of modern behavioral sink, and the systemic erosion of traditional masculine sovereignty within these hyper-optimized social hierarchies. We're treating your sources not just as social commentary, but really as a diagnostic map of a societal inflection point.
Yeah, let's unpack this right away, because you're throwing around some big ideas there. We're looking at a biological collision, social hierarchies, and this thing you're calling a behavioral sink. What are the critical frameworks we need to use to understand what happened to Sarah and her husband?
We'll use 3 really powerful frameworks, and they're derived directly from the source material to get our heads around this transition. First, we have the core problem of evolutionary mismatch. This is the profound, often destabilizing conflict between our ancient Pleistocene neurobiology, the brain we all inherited, and the abstract, endless demands of modern digital tools.
Okay, so old brain, new tech. Got it.
Exactly. Second, we'll analyze the rise of what's called managerial emotional labor. This is the insidious, invisible work created by the sheer act of optimizing these complex systems.
The committee her husband refused to join.
Precisely. And finally, we'll explore the concept of the behavioral sink. This is ethologist John B. Calhoun's model for psychological and social collapse, as it applies to the modern, hyper-optimized environment. We're investigating how the smart home, designed for convenience, is instead making the fundamental human contract, functionally brittle.
So the goal here is to figure out if this is just a domestic spat, or if we're actually watching the beginning of social breakdown, orchestrated by an algorithm. Let's start with the hard data on what you call the digital chores trap. We were promised a utopia of leisure, right? But the research tells a completely different story about the actual workload.
It really does. The social psychology data is stark. The integration of AI assistance, it hasn't ushered in liberation at all. It has led to what the sources term a covert power redistribution. And we run into this core contradiction. Fully automated smart homes have actually resulted in women reporting a staggering 72% increase in what's classified as managerial emotional labor.
72%. That's astonishing. The technology is supposed to do the work, so how can the workload increase by such a huge margin?
Because the labor has completely shifted. It's no longer physical, it's cognitive, it's regulatory, and it's emotional.
Okay.
The physical chore of scrubbing the floor is replaced, yes, but it's replaced by the mental chore of managing the robot that scrubs the floor. You have to monitor its schedule, update its firmware, integrate its data stream, and then troubleshoot its errors. The promised leisure time has been replaced by a new, and I'd say insidious form of work, the infinite curation of an algorithmic environment.
So the insight here is, the smart home doesn't get rid of work, it just asets. It upgrades the invisible workload from, say, physical exhaustion to psychological management. The AI is basically a high-maintenance colleague who just keeps creating new optional work for you. And your contract, in a sense, mandates you manage that colleague.
That is an excellent way to frame it. The sources actually call this the digital chores trap. It's the realization that the only thing AI consistently automates is the generation of new, optional managerial tasks.
And if the AI is constantly generating new things to worry about or optimize, it hooks directly into a pre-existing psychological vulnerability, one that seems to disproportionately affect one gender.
Which brings us to the biological substrate and this highly theoretical but really compelling idea of the female psyche as an environmental control algorithm. This moves us out of sociology and into the realm of biological essentialism, which is rooted in parental investment theory, or PIT. PIT observes that across mammalian species, females bear the significantly higher minimum biological cost of reproduction. We're talking gestation, lactation, and that prolonged period of vulnerability that's required to raise dependent offspring.
So the woman is inherently the higher biological investment party in the whole reproductive contract.
Exactly. And this profound asymmetry forged a really powerful, hardwired adaptive mechanism, one necessary for survival, and that is hypervigilant environmental control.
Right.
For the ancestral female, managing the security, the hygiene, the immediate resource availability of the dwelling, the nest, if you will, was a direct, non-negotiable predictor of whether her offspring would survive to reproductive age. A male could afford to take a risk outside the camp. The female could not afford to be cavalier about a spoiled resource or an unsafe dwelling when her genetic future was literally inside that vulnerable space.
So can we call this the nesting instinct on steroids, just to make it clearer for you listening? It sounds like the brain is hardwired for constant low-level risk assessment within the home perimeter.
That's a highly functional analogy. The source material argues that this drive to manage, optimize, and control the domestic sphere is a hardwired risk aversion protocol. Her constant interaction with the AI, scheduling maintenance, monitoring the air quality, adjusting temperatures, is essentially a continuous, digitally mediated sovereignty claim over the immediate reproductive environment. This managerial effort is the modern, abstract expression of an ancient, non-negotiable biological imperative. This is the management premium she feels compelled to pay.
And this is where the collision happens, right? The evolutionary mismatch. If this instinct is designed to solve high-stakes, low-frequency Pleistocene problems, like detecting a predator or a truly deadly pathogen, what happens when you feed that anxiety system an infinitely generating stream of low-stakes digital problems?
That is the technological hijack. The AI doesn't reduce this ancient anxiety, it weaponizes it. It does that by perfectly accommodating the risk aversion protocol while overwhelming it with, frankly, irrelevance. The evolutionary mismatch perspective states that psychiatric conditions can often be seen as evolved states that become pathological because of features of modern environments.
And the smart home is a perfect example.
The perfect example of a modern environment creating pathology.
It provides the brain with a fire hose of data. Let's detail that data fire hose. What are we actually being alerted about?
Well, we're talking about real-time energy consumption graphs measured in milliwatts. Food freshness metrics measured down to the hour, not days, but hours in the smart fridge.
To the hour, wow.
Air quality indexes that fluctuate based on microparticulates, and predictive maintenance alerts for the washing machine seals that you didn't even know existed. Each new data point, no matter how trivial like that 2% humidity fluctuation in the nursery, is a potential false crisis. It's abstract, but it activates the primal management pulse. You have to process it, decide on a course of action, and execute it, or you risk violating the nest.
It sounds utterly exhausting. It's turning a critical but occasional task survival risk assessment into this high-frequency, low-stakes micro-threat system.
Yeah.
You're constantly in a state of alert over things that just wouldn't have mattered 5 years ago.
And the labor is now overwhelmingly cognitive and emotional. Processing, deciding, worrying, curating, the brain is calibrated for tangible survival threats in a world of limited information, but now it's being hijacked by the abstract, endless streams of a digital panopticon. The core psychological trap is that the goalpost of clean enough, safe enough, or organized enough has receded into a digital horizon.
There's no endpoint.
Never. The AI constantly suggests the next level of optimization, forcing the individual, the women in this case, into an infinite hallway of optimization. The technology hasn't liberated women from their biology. It has simply created an inescapable digital interface for that biology's most anxious expression.
It sounds like the AI is turning anxiety into an operational manual. So we have the hypervigilant manager on one side, driven by this deeply ancient instinct that has been digitally weaponized. Now we turn to the husband, the man who refuses to validate the algorithmic grocery queue. Society tends to label this withdrawal as laziness, right, or emotional incompetence. But isn't this rational retreat just a modern justification for traditional gender roles? I mean, are we just excusing laziness with evolutionary psychology?
That's a crucial and a challenging question. The sources argue, however, that while the outcome might resemble traditional roles, the underlying mechanism is not laziness. It's a fundamental misdiagnosis of competence and resource allocation. The sources frame this withdrawal not as a moral failing, but as a rational cost-benefit analysis rooted in a fundamentally different evolutionary script.
How so?
Well, the male genetic program is historically oriented toward external resource acquisition and defense, the classic hunting and protecting paradigm.
Right.
For most of human history, a man's fitness value is tied to bringing high-value resources into the nest or successfully expanding the territory. The primary imperative was efficacy in the outside world, not micromanagement within the dwelling.
So if his value is tied to conquering an external world, then participating in what the sources call the trivia of grocery list algorithms offers almost no evolutionary or social return. It's just a bad trade for his finite energy.
Precisely. Engaging in that domestic micromanagement offers negligible returns in terms of perceived mate value or core evolutionary competencies. If he spends 2 hours optimizing the smart fridge settings, does that make him a better provider or protector? No. In fact, it drains energy he could use for high-value external competition. Therefore, the withdrawal, the refusal to engage in the algorithmic complexity, is a risk-hedging strategy. It's a defense mechanism to preserve sovereignty of mind and purpose, avoiding the competence hierarchy of domestic micromanagement.
I understand that. If he engages, he risks being judged inadequate by the AI or by his partner who's armed with the AI's data. If he doesn't engage, he's labeled lazy, but he maintains his energy and focus for external high-value pursuits. It really is a rational choice for self-preservation of purpose. He's avoiding the low marginal return management black hole.
And this dynamic creates a situation of functional irrelevance, which is toxic to the male psyche. We can see this vividly in the case files analyzed in your source material. These are real-world accounts of men dealing with hyper-optimization.
Let's look at the case file of Hiroshi, the Tokyo engineer. This sounds like a textbook example of technological obsolescence leading to psychological retreat.
Hiroshi lived in this hyper-optimized, very small apartment governed by an AI called the Pulse. His wife, Kaori, monitored this dashboard constantly, treating every single alert as a matter of nest defense. Hiroshi already worked extremely long hours in a demanding tech firm, fulfilling that external provider role, but when he came home, his traditional expertise was just nullified. When he tried to offer input or suggest a simple, practical solution to a domestic issue, the AI immediately countered him with optimal data, and Kaori dismissed his suggestion as irrelevant to the system's logic.
The technology literally replaced his expertise. He could no longer be the expert in his own home. He lost his domain.
His function was rendered obsolete by the sensor array, and the consequence was a systemic erosion of masculine agency. Hiroshi eventually stopped speaking in the house altogether. His preferred state was silence. He began spending his weekends in unoptimized public parks or 24-hour diners, anywhere that offered an escape from the monitored zone. He became essentially a ghost in a machine that he was still paying to maintain, fully aware that his physical presence held less value than the sensor array.
That is just deeply isolating. And Mark, the San Francisco engineer, his story suggests the system caused actual physical stress.
Yes, Mark and his partner Elena lived in a sentient home where the entire environment was run by a surveillance AI, constantly tracking a safety and wellness score. Mark experienced a profound and debilitating evolutionary mismatch. His ancestral neurobiology, his Stone Age brain, was constantly being triggered by false positive threats.
Every time he forgot to log his water intake or walked with shoes on the carpet,
Rouse would chirp.
So his brain interpreted these mundane digital pings and beeps as the equivalent of a predator in the bushes, a constant breach in protocol. He was in a state of perpetual abstract anxiety.
The psychological toll was a Pleistocene nightmare. Elena, feeling empowered by the data, she saw the surveillance as control. Mark saw it as a hostile environment. His fundamental nest defense instinct was short-circuited by the infinite data stream. His ultimate response was the calculated retreat. He stopped engaging with the systems, emotionally withdrew from the digital home, and eventually moved into a small, dumb cabin in the woods with no internet access.
Wow.
This wasn't laziness, it was psychological survival.
Rejecting the upgrade to save his sanity this calculated retreat, this sort of non-violent non-cooperation, it sounds like the final stage of purpose dissolution. This is where the analogy to the behavioral sink becomes chillingly relevant.
The source material links this rational male withdrawal directly to the early phases of Calhoun's famed experiments. When a man's function is replaced by a sensor, and he is then demanded to manage the sensor, a task of low evolutionary returns, he risks the dissolution of vital energy into functional irrelevance. This psychological process is a precursor to the ultimate fate of the withdrawn, passive, non-reproducing individuals known as the beautiful ones. They were observed in the final phase of the mouse utopia experiment. The smart home, instead of nurturing a complementary union, becomes a zone of digital conflict, leading to social atomization, where the human contract simply becomes too brittle to maintain.
This link to the behavioral sink is the core theory tying together the domestic conflict and the broader social implications. To really appreciate the gravity of that analogy, we need to dive into the core research by John B. Calhoun. We're not talking about rats, of course, but the patterns of withdrawal and collapse that Calhoun observed offer a chilling metaphor for the hyper-optimized home we started with.
Indeed, the term behavioral sink was coined by ethologist John B. Calhoun back in 1962. He used it to describe the collapse in social behavior that results from overpopulation and, critically, overcrowding. His work with Norway rats and later mice, particularly the Universe 25 experiment, provides a detailed, if non-human, model for how social structures degrade despite material abundance.
So let's start with those early rat experiments. Yeah. What was the setup that first produced this concept?
Calhoun placed brown Norwegian rats in a large enclosure, an environment he called a mortality-inhibiting environment. They had unlimited resources: food, water, complete protection from predators, disease, weather. It was, on the surface, a rat utopia, and yet what he observed was profound social disruption and pathology.
If they had unlimited resources, why did the social structure collapse? Why didn't they just thrive?
The critical variable was social interaction overload. Despite having plenty of space in the enclosure overall, the rats began to crowd together in one specific pen, particularly during feeding. Calhoun dubbed this the behavioral sink. As many as 60 of the 80 rats would assemble there.
Wow.
This extreme local density, despite the availability of resources and space elsewhere, is what drove the behavioral disturbances. The rats just became overwhelmed by the sheer number of mandatory social interactions.
And what specific pathologies did he document in these high-density areas?
The pathologies were staggering. They included a complete breakdown of traditional rat society. Males became hyper-aggressive toward the weak, and others became entirely passive. There was sexual deviation, with dominant males attempting to mate with young or uninterested females, and some males exhibiting hypersexuality while others just withdrew completely. Cannibalism, especially of the young, and frenetic overactivity were also common.
That sounds like a complete societal collapse. What was the most chilling metric of reproductive failure?
In those rat populations where the behavioral sink fully developed, parental competence just vanished. Females became disoriented, abandoning their nests or simply failing to build them. They stopped carrying their pregnancies to term. The infant mortality rate ran as high as 96% among the most disoriented groups. So the social organization, and thus the ability to successfully raise young, was completely disrupted, regardless of material abundance.
That brings us to the most famous iteration of this work, Universe 25, conducted with mice between 1968 and 1972. This experiment pushed the concept of the mortality-inhibiting environment to its absolute long-term limit.
Universe 25 was designed to be the definitive test. It was a massive cage environment where food and water were perpetually replenished, built to tolerate a theoretical maximum of 4,000 mice. The mice began to breed, and the population peaked pretty quickly at 2,200, far below the theoretical carrying capacity.
Right.
But instead of leveling off or finding equilibrium, the population began a rapid, irreversible decline. By the 600th day, the population was functionally extinct, with no surviving young.
So even with space still available and resources abundant, the society failed. What defined the collapse in Universe 25 specifically?
The collapse was marked by 4 distinct behavioral phases. The first 2 involved initial colonization and rapid growth. Phase 3, the stagnation phase, was defined by a breakdown of social roles. Males lost the ability to court and protect their territory. Females lost the ability to successfully mother their young. Infant mortality stabilized near 100%.
And within that stagnation, that's where we find the pathologically withdrawn mice, the beautiful ones. This is the group that's directly connected to the male retreat we see in the smart home.
That's correct. The beautiful ones represented the ultimate retreat from the social demands of the sink. They were passive, avoiding conflict entirely, emerging only when other mice were asleep to eat and drink. Their most notable trait was obsessive, compulsive self-grooming. They were physically immaculate with pristine coats, hence the name, which Calhoun meant ironically. But psychologically, they were inert.
They looked perfect, but they had lost their purpose.
They were spiritually dead. They lost the social scripts and skills required to mate, refusing to engage in courtship rituals. They were physically able to reproduce but chose not to, effectively opting out of the reproductive cycle altogether. They achieved perfect cleanliness and serenity at the cost of function. Calhoun himself saw the fate of these mice as a metaphor for humankind, characterizing the social breakdown as spiritual death.
That's a powerful metaphor for the modern man who finds his traditional function obsolete in the hyper-optimized domestic environment. But we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of simple extrapolation. I mean, we are not mice. Do we have any evidence from humans or other primates that suggests we cope better?
The sources caution strongly against simple extrapolation, you're right. Psychological experiments measuring the effects of high density on humans found mixed results, but critically, little evidence of the dire, irreversible pathological consequences seen in the rat model. Humans seem far more adept at adapting and avoiding open conflict.
And what of our closest relatives? How do primates cope with the acute stress of crowding?
Primates, like rhesus monkeys and chimpanzees, show highly sophisticated coping strategies that involve cognitive restraint. Research on crowded chimpanzee groups showed that despite a 20-fold reduction in space, aggression only increased slightly. Crucially, they increased friendly grooming and greetings, like submissive bowing and kissing, to mitigate the overwhelming tension created by density. This conciliatory behavior acted as a deliberate counter-strategy to conflict.
So instead of dissolving into conflict or withdrawal, they actively lean into social repair to maintain the group structure.
Exactly. Rhesus monkeys, which are famously pugnacious, showed no change in male aggressiveness under crowding, but the males significantly increased friendly contact, grooming females more frequently. Among non-kin females, aggression increased, but it was coupled with increased grooming and submissive grinning, a concerted effort to improve potentially volatile relationships. They demonstrated a level of emotional restraint and social sophistication that rats simply do not possess.
That control comes at a cost, though, doesn't it? Even if they suppress the aggression, they must be feeling the stress.
They absolutely are. Researchers measured stress in chimpanzees by recording self-scratching, a recognized sign of anxiety, and by analyzing fecal samples for the stress hormone cortisol. Even when conflict was suppressed, anxiety was high, especially when crowding was combined with secondary stressors like noise from neighboring groups. They were working hard to maintain the peace, which is mentally taxing.
And the elevator effect is a very relatable human example of that emotional restraint we deploy to manage density.
The elevator effect describes how both humans and chimpanzees handle acute short-term crowding. We minimize movement, loud verbalizations, social engagement. We try to lie low and be as small as possible to avoid friction.
Yeah.
Chimpanzees showed this same withdrawal tactic, being less aggressive when briefly crowded. It's a mechanism of emotional restraint.
This nuanced primate in human data provides the critical update to Calhoun's theory then. If density alone isn't the trigger for us, what is the true trigger for the behavioral sink in a human context?
The conclusion from the primate research is vital. While humans and other primates have an underappreciated talent for dealing with physical crowding, the most likely trigger for the full-blown behavioral sink is not crowding alone, but crowding combined with scarcity of resources or opportunities. The loss of function and the inability to establish a purpose, combined with high-density interaction, is the true collapse mechanism. And this leads us directly to the modern digital condition. The scarcity we face is no longer physical resources, but something far more abstract.
So if the behavioral sink is triggered by crowding plus scarcity, and we live in a world of hyperabundance, unlimited food, water, connectivity, then what is the scarce resource in the algorithmically managed smart home? It's certainly not space or resources.
The scarcity is psychic freedom and personal autonomy. The digital world provides infinite information and connection, creating a relentless crowding effect in our cognition, that fire hose of data we talked about, but it simultaneously extracts the resource of self-determination. Our ability to choose and act freely is slowly being eroded.
This brings us to the architecture of exploitation, surveillance capitalism. How does this system turn our inner life and our private activities into raw material that restricts our freedom?
Well, Shoshana Zuboff's work defines this global economic system and explains how social media and online tech giants operate. They harvest our raw material, our attention, our emotions, our psychic life, and they mold it into highly accurate, predictive models of our future behavior. This data extraction process is single-mindedly attuned to profit-making, regardless of the psychological well-being of the population it relies upon.
And these companies are constantly working to keep us engaged, to keep us generating data, raining down those rings, bells, and notifications.
They keep us in what has been described as a never-ending, mutually infectious cycle like rats in a maze. Everything we do online, and critically in the smart home, is collected, stored, and analyzed, forming a personal profile measured by the OCEAM model.
The EAM model is used by psychologists to measure personality traits. For you listening who might not be familiar, what are those traits and how are they being weaponized?
OCEAN stands for openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. For each user, the oceans of data collected generate a precise percentage score for each category, creating a highly accurate predictive model of that person's personality and behavior. This predictability is the fundamental commodity sold in the market.
So, if I'm highly conscientious, the algorithm knows I'll respond better to an alert about firmware updates or a reminder to organize my schedule than to a random social notification. It knows exactly which button to push to make me generate more data.
Precisely. And that personalized approach bypasses conscious thought. This information is sold at auction 24 hours a day to advertisers. The business model relies on the ability to determine precisely what we will think, feel, say, or do. The algorithms then use notifications, pings, and prompts, which is exactly what we see in the smart home, to gently nudge users, imperceptibly altering the natural course of our decision-making processes toward specific, targeted directions of consumption or compliance.
And here is the critical link. Back to the smart home. How are those fridges and vacuums actively generating this kind of psychological data?
The smart home devices are the ultimate data extraction tool because they observe us in our most private, unvarnished state. Your smart thermostat records your response time to a comfort alert, which measures neuroticism.
Right.
Your smart fridge records how often you abandon a suggested recipe list, which measures openness to experience. Your smart security cameras, even if they're only tracking movement, record your activity patterns, offering highly granular data on your levels of conscientiousness and extroversion. The minute Sarah checks the humidity in the nursery, she is generating data on her neuroticism score that the system can then use to predict her response to the next optimization demand. This turns the domestic sphere into a factory floor for psychic raw material, which is then sold to gently nudge her behavior, eroding her sense of free will.
The devastating implication for personal autonomy is clear. If machines already know what we will do tomorrow, next week, or next month, what psychic freedom do we actually possess? We've lost that scarcity of autonomy.
And this creates a profound psychological toll that hits the core human drive for growth. C.G. Jung explained that for growth and fulfillment, what he called the individuation process, the ego must grow strong by repeatedly enduring the tension produced when conscious and unconscious imperatives inevitably clash. You have to face the unruly complexes, the shadow emotions, and negotiate with them.
But the digital landscape provides a convenient instant escape hatch from that difficult, necessary tension. We just scroll past the difficult emotions.
It functions as a powerful digital psychic pacifier that effectively kills the individuation process by helping us escape those shadow emotions instantly. Instead of integrating the shadow, we run to the scroll. This digital landscape, the sources argue, behaves as a second collective unconscious, but one that is insidious, infectious, predatory, and designed for immediate action in its host consciousness, rather than wisdom or growth.
I remember the chilling observation that individuals captured by the infinite scroll are being inwardly infected.
Yes, the observation is that it is almost as if the ever-expanding human shadow has undergone a metamorphosis into computer code, which then seeps back into us while we stare at our screens. This is the sense of being captured by the dark spell of the digital inwardly infected by flesh-eating machine viruses. The consequence of this psychic colonization is a slow, steady loss of self-sovereignty, creating the perfect digital behavioral sink. Cognitive crowding combined with the scarcity of autonomy. This systemic exploitation of the psyche moves seamlessly into the domestic sphere when we analyze the concept of emotional labor, or EL, and how it has been weaponized. Arlie Hochschild initially defined emotional labor sociologically as managing one's own emotions and the emotions of others to meet job expectations, like a flight attendant's mandatory smile.
But the term has undergone what she called concept creep and is now commonly applied to the private sphere, right? particularly unpaid household managerial tasks, like having to remind a partner of chores or managing social calendars.
That modern application is key, as it defines the often invisible burden, which is highly gendered. Work that requires caring and empathizing is stereotyped as female, forming what has been called an emotional proletariat. Sociological studies argue that these necessary soft tasks are often excluded from formal job descriptions and compensation because of the lingering sexist notion that the labor is simply to be expected of women by virtue of their gender. The work becomes invisible and therefore uncompensated.
So we have a collision. The AI home massively increases this already invisible managerial labor by 72%, and then traditional gender expectations demand women shoulder the entire increase. This is where the concept of biological rent-seeking enters the picture, creating a toxic contractual asymmetry in the marriage.
The sources posit that the traditional implicit home contract male provision and protection in exchange for female domestic and child-rearing management is shattered by the introduction of AI and the resulting managerial vacuum. It is replaced by the demand that men become co-managers of the algorithmic uterus, a domain where their participation is strategically costly and, biologically speaking, superfluous to their core evolutionary identity.
Let's analyze the case file of Clara, the London professional, and her emotional labor log. This perfectly illustrates the attempt to formalize and weaponize this invisible work to enforce a new contract.
Clara, a high-achieving finance professional, used a sophisticated domestic management suite to run her house, logging every task, every mental note, every planning moment. She actively weaponized her emotional labor log, a digital ledger tracking every micro-decision she made, as a form of social currency. She presented these logs during what she called relationship performance reviews to prove her partner, James, was failing to meet his 50% domestic management quota.
But from James's perspective, which the sources also detail, his pushback was a rational cost-benefit analysis. He felt 90% of the tasks the AI generated were unnecessary micromanagement that provided zero marginal utility to their actual quality of life. He felt taxed for his wife's hobby.
He perceived this highly leveraged managerial style not as a burden Clara was forced to carry, but as a hyper-optimization she had chosen, which she then used data to tax him for. The sources frame Clara's effort, buttressed by AI data, as biological rent-seeking. She is weaponizing her natural female instinct for environmental control, now digitally magnified, to extract labor from James. This effort successfully offsets the diminishing marginal utility of his traditional provider role, because his income no longer buys him peace of mind or sovereignty inside the home. He's being forced into functional irrelevance by managerial compliance.
So, the smart home has given women the perfect objective tool, the data log, to enforce a new, more onerous contractual arrangement that fundamentally undermines the male evolutionary script of external resource acquisition. The erosion of trust is inevitable when intimacy and care become transactional, measurable, and logged.
And this dynamic is part of a broader societal trend, the commodification of intimacy in the marketplace.
We see this extending beyond the home and into platforms like OnlyFans and digital dating environments.
Yeah.
Intimacy has shifted from the sacred private sphere to something measurable, marketable, and consumable.
Exactly. These platforms, while they may promise empowerment and autonomy for creators by allowing them control over image and income, fundamentally recast closeness and attention as content exchanged for money. The exchange is governed entirely by market logic subscriptions, clicks, algorithmic visibility, and the relentless consuming gaze of the consumer.
That creates a paradox of empowerment versus exploitation. When human connection is reduced to a consumable product, the illusion of control masks a subtle dependence on the market, blurring the line between intimacy and transaction.
And this shifts expectations inside personal relationships. Desire is no longer confined to private imagination. It is curated, monetized, and endlessly available in the market. When intimate behaviors, affection, and attentiveness can be logged, measured, or monetized externally, it fundamentally changes what is expected and what is valued inside a private partnership. The relationship moves from contract to commercial ledger, accelerating the brittleness of the human bond we identified earlier.
Let's bring this all together. We started with a simple domestic tension between Sarah and her husband, and we found a massive global collision point. The AI home has not only weaponized an ancient biological mandate for women, transforming environmental control into an inescapable digital panopticon, but it has simultaneously created an existential crisis for the male evolutionary script, rendering the traditional provider functionally irrelevant. The combination of digital crowding, that fire hose of data, and the scarcity of autonomy is playing out the behavioral sync dynamics of atomization and withdrawal on a digital stage. The human contract is indeed functionally brittle.
And this requires an amoral observation to be clearly understood. Nature is not moral, it is only functional. We have seen that the technological environment has successfully integrated with our deepest evolutionary programming, leading to these profound and unintended functional consequences for both sexes.
So what's the functional takeaway for the female psyche, the one driving the total domestic optimization?
For the female psyche, the constant busyness with the AI is merely the digital extension of a biological mandate. The first step toward reclaiming psychic autonomy is recognizing this managerial impulse for what it is, a risk aversion protocol, rather than viewing it purely as an external imposition. Conscious management of this impulse is required. You must control the algorithm, not surrender to its infinite demands.
And for the male psyche, trying to maintain sovereignty in this digitally colonized environment.
The imperative is to shift decisively from a purely provider mindset to an observer mindset. The rational male response, as we saw in the source data, is the strategic avoidance of tasks that guarantee functional irrelevance. Sovereignty depends on resisting the transactional analysis of emotional labor, the logging, the metrics, the guilt that seeks to force one into becoming a junior administrator in the mother matrix. The final verdict is not to seek equality in the trivia of algorithms, as this is a functional trap. It's a Mobius strip with no exit. The only intelligent response is to see the game for what it is and refuse to play by rules that guarantee obsolescence.